My talk today, the impact of earthquakes on Gerasa and other cities of the Decapolis. Now, we've been to Gerasa before. Today, we're returning to this wonderful ancient Roman city in northern Jordan, at the very edge of Rome's Eastern Empire. In previous talks, I and David have discussed the background on the city's growth, how the interpretation of aerial and ground photography can help fill in the archaeological gaps in our knowledge of the history of its development and on its water delivery system. Today, I want to discuss with you a subject that is integral in understanding the history of the city and of its sister cities in the Decapolis, and that is the impact of earthquakes. First of all, let's just see where we're talking about. We're talking about the eastern end of the Mediterranean. This plan on the right-hand side shows the disposition of the various major towns in the Decapolis and their supposed area of control, although it's to be said that, in fact, the boundaries there are pretty rubbery. We're rather uncertain as to the boundaries in some cases. North to south, we're probably talking about from the Sea of Galilee to Philadelphia, which is modern Amman, we're probably talking 200 kilometres, so just bear that in mind to put the whole thing in some sort of geographic context. Gerasa was one of the cities of the Decapolis, a group of Hellenistic settlements established in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. The settlement grew rapidly under Roman rule, and the ruins that greet the modern visitor mainly date to the Roman Byzantine period that ended with the Muslim conquest in the 7th century AD. By the 10th, 11th century, we're uncertain, the settlement had shrunk in size to that perhaps of a village, for reasons that we really don't fully understand at the moment, and tumbled into obscurity until rediscovered by European explorers in the early 19th century. The city lies in a rich, well-watered valley in hilly country, which is completely different to what you think about when you hear about Jordan, which you imagine to be desert, and it is largely desert, but we're talking about the northwestern part of the Ajalon Highlands, where it rains regularly every year, pretty much only in winter time. And the valleys that drain these highlands have good soils, often lots of natural springs, and Gerasa was established in one such valley. This picture here shows the city looking to the north, and as you would have come from Philadelphia to the south through this gate, Hadrian's Arch, established in the 2nd century, you would have gone up, walked up or driven up to the south gate, you'd have gone into the city, and that's defined by this red line, which is the ancient walls built perhaps certainly by the time of the 4th century. The academics are still arguing as to when precisely. So you're in the city, you have this wonderful oval piazza lined with its colonnade, and at the end of that you start the Cardo Maximus, the main street on the west side of the city, takes you up to the north gate, and there was a road that went beyond that up the valley. Between the north gate here and this area here, Berkatane, there was a road, and either side of that road it was lined with tombs, temples, and later churches. In fact, the city is in two halves. The wadi cuts the city into two unequal parts. On the right-hand side, and this is done in 1928, that was the village established by Circassian settlers brought in 1878, 50 years before this photograph was taken. So although the town was established on both sides, we know virtually nothing about the eastern side of the city. Now, I know a number of you have visited the site. It's second most popular tourist destination in Jordan after Petra. But the modern site, with its clean colonnaded streets and restored monuments, is very different from the vast sea of stone ruins that greeted the first Western visitors in the early 19th century. What did they see? Well, on the left-hand side you have one of the first photographs taken in 1844. Bear in mind, photography is was only really invented within 10 years prior to that. It's actually a lithograph of a photograph, because in those days it was probably a daguerreotype and they had no means of readily stabilising them and then copying them for publication. So what they did is, some poor soul had the job of creating a lithograph from a photograph. Extraordinary. But you do get the sense, it's taken from the middle, it's actually taken from Artemis, which is on top of a hill. You're looking south. Looking south with, that's Hadrian's Arch at the southern end that I mentioned before. Right-hand side is the east side of the city as seen in 1875, still before the Circassians settled, so they hadn't started to loot, remove and build on top of the eastern side. But you can see it's just a mass of ruins, and very little discernible, with perhaps that building there, you probably barely see it, is actually the massive east baths on the east side of the city. It was all that was left. The rest was just a mass of ruins. They couldn't figure out what was going on. There were a number of visitors, Western visitors, starting with Seetzen in 1806. In 1816, an Englishman and a bunch of pals, an Englishman called William John Banks, described the eastern side as you see there. It's upon the slant of a hill, and as it seems to offer a confused extent of rubbish and shapeless ruins without columns or architectural decoration, it's probable that it's the quarter where the inferior class resided, or where at least, possibly from the form of the ground, it had not been thought fit to place any of the public buildings. Well, Banks was a privileged member of the British gentry and clearly a snob, but his descriptions of the site echo those of early visitors. And if you look at that right-hand slide, you can see, that eastern side of the city looked pretty tough. Another view of the west side of the city, this time seen from the east bank. This is a photograph taken in 1858 by Frenchman Guillaume Rey. Also a lithograph, but this one is a fine bit of work. This must have sent the lithographer blind doing this, but it does have a wealth of detail in it. And you can see just emerging from shapeless mass of ruins are these major monuments, which in fact were the very monuments that were excavated subsequently. And this side of the city, the west side, is now preserved as an archaeological park. So when you go to Jerash, you're outside the tourist bus and you start walking up, you only see the west side. It's all that's exposed. Now, importantly, from an archaeological viewpoint, the ruins have been left undisturbed by intense human occupation for a long time, meaning that the looting and stone robbing so prevalent elsewhere in cities and towns of the Roman Empire was avoided. And those of you who have visited Roman ruins in Britain or in Europe will know that most of them are down to ground level because everything above that's been removed. But it leaves the integrity of the city's footprint largely intact until the arrival of the Circassian settlers in the late 19th century, who made up for some of what had happened in the past. They just saw this great rockery as manna from heaven, I think. The apparent absence of imposing monuments on the East Bank and the negative commentary, such as that by William John Banks, was to have later ramifications, and that it led early archaeologists to view the eastern side of the city as being less interesting than the city on the opposite bank. So no systematic evaluation of the East Bank ruins was attempted before the Circassian settlers built their village there and in 1878 and plundered the ruins for the stone to build their houses, and no proper survey was ever carried out subsequently, so we know virtually nothing of half of this wonderful city. So what was the cause of this massive ruination we see in these early pictures? Historic earthquake evidence can come from a number of different sources: written records, inscriptions, archaeology, and geology, that for various reasons are rarely concurrent. The total record is also incomplete, so that there are many earthquake events that are simply not recorded. This point has perhaps not been fully appreciated in the past, so that there are many examples of an archaeological interpretation being forced to fit an event for which there is evidence. Also, archaeological records, especially the earlier ones, do not necessarily include enough detail to determine whether destruction is due to seismic forces or some other reason. These issues are summed up rather nicely in observations made in the late 19th century visitor to Gerasa by a chap, Prince Abimelech Lazarev, a rich member of the Russian aristocracy, and in fact, I believe to this day, I believe in Moscow, there is his house there is like been made into a museum. He was a seriously rich character. Now, I'm not suggesting you read necessarily all of that, but basically the bones of what he was talking about is that private dwellings are often poorly constructed in the first place, and they might fall down of their own volition. Larger, better-built structures such as temples survive better, and Gerasa is a living monument to that. Yes, earthquakes are certainly one possible cause, but there's also wars and conflict, looting and stone robbing by subsequent occupiers, and weathering effects, natural decay. These are all factors, and he actually recognised this back in the late 19th century, and it's perhaps because it was written in Russian that nobody seems to have taken any notice ever since. All these things can be seen, I believe, in the ruins of Gerasa. We're now going to turn to the seismological setting, which is a bit like Geology 101. So just bear with me, and I know there's some geologists here who are going to call me to account if I get this wrong. In terms of currently accepted plate tectonics model, the Earth's outer layer or crust is broken into pieces called tectonic plates. These plates are constantly moving towards, away from, and past each other. And because continents form part of these plates, they also move. And an earthquake occurs when the rocks break and move as a result of stresses caused by the plate movements. These pictures here show the regional situation. All this is relevant, all this plate tectonics is relevant because Gerasa lies 28 kilometres from the eastern edge of the Dead Sea Transform. Dead Sea Transform is a geological term. You might also know it as a Dead Sea Fault, Dead Sea Rift Zone. They're all the same place. A major north-south trending zone that extends for some 1,200 kilometres from Red Sea in the south to Turkey in the north. It's called a transform because the relative movements within it are lateral rather than vertical. The Western African plate has moved southwest relative to the Arabian plate at the average speed of 5 millimetres per annum. Can't believe who works this stuff out, but anyway. So, I can find the button. You can see, this is a topic, this image here is a topographic map, effectively, and you can see that rift zone running like tram lines up the centre there. That is the zone we're talking about. And you can see Gerasa sits just on the right-hand side of it, just on the edge. If you look at the right-hand image, you can see which puts the epicenters or the places where the earthquakes emanated from on a map. And it puts in a context both of the Near East and also of a much bigger area. And you can actually see there's plenty of places worse, actually, on that basis. But nevertheless, we're talking about the Dead Sea Fault area. And if we look back over the last 2,000 years, more or less, that plan there shows you the epicenters of those larger quakes. Pretty much the same plan. There has been no published study of Gerasa's earthquake history. Our knowledge of the earthquake history of the neighbouring Decapolis site of Pella, which is located 30 kilometres to the northwest, is much more advanced, thanks to long-term excavation programs, carried out incidentally largely by Australians, that are focused on domestic dwellings as well as larger monuments and buildings. Pella also lies on the east side of the Jordan Valley, immediately adjacent, in fact, it's on the eastern edge of the seismically active Dead Sea Transform, which means that the major earthquakes that affected Gerasa would very probably have been felt even more strongly at Pella. In contrast, the archaeological study of suburban Gerasa is in its infancy, the result of decades, and I'm talking about 80 years of over-focus on the major monuments. The study of domestic dwellings is important because, as we have already noted, Their weaker style of construction often made rubble walls using lime mortar and poorly constructed anyway, compared to better built and more massive stone structures that typify public buildings and monuments, means that these domestic structures more readily show the impact of earthquakes. And so what does the archaeological record of Gerasa tell us? I've shown some pictures here of some of the monuments, you might even recognise them, from your own visits. Top left is the Zeus temple. It actually was surrounded by large columns all the way around. It's a peripteral temple, and you can see the ruins of these columns lying in front of it. That's how it appeared actually in the early 18th century, although that picture was taken later in the early 19th century. That picture was taken in the late 19th century. On the top right, the oval piazza. We're going to look at that in more detail in a minute, but it just ruins everywhere. Bottom left, the South Theatre. That was a bit of a sad case. And the Proper Layer Church, which is actually on the west side of the city, but on the east, just east of the Cardo, overlooking the Wadi, and you can see you're looking east there over the Circassian village. So that's what the monuments looked like before they were cleared up and restored. Stone columns often readily show the effect of earthquakes, and the hundreds of columns built to line the colonnaded streets and used to construct the temples and churches in Gerasa offer plenty of examples. In some cases, rows of columns were thrown down in a certain direction, and while it's tempting to think that this can actually be used to determine the direction of the earthquake wave, sadly, modern research has shown that while this may be true for a single standalone column, it's rarely the case when we're dealing with columns made of segments joined together by their entablatures. I wasn't aware of this myself until I did the research. The critical factor seems to be as to how perfectly the column base, the base of the column, sits on its own base. I've got some examples here taken from Gerasa, firstly, showing just that, the preferred orientation of the way these things are thrown down. Octagonal Church actually lies about 500 metres north of the town. Nobody ever goes there anymore. It's surrounded by farmland. But you can see here how these columns have all fallen in a certain direction. You can see their entablatures, their architraves lying adjacent. The other end, this is actually a church, the Octagonal Church, and this is the atrium. These columns here have actually been restored to their original position. And the giveaway is their architraves have not been relocated, so you can see those also were lying in that direction. That's a modern aerial photograph. The top right, we're looking at the Synagogue Church, which is a small church that lies in the west side of the city above the Temple of Artemis. And there you're looking east, and you can clearly see these columns have all fallen to the north. You won't see that today because that site's been cleaned up. Bottom left, the so-called Cross Church. This was only discovered 2 years ago through excavation, and you can see how, again, the columns are aligned in a certain direction, which is, in this case, is east. On the bottom right, again, a picture that was taken in the 30s. We have St. Theodore's Church, one of the largest churches on the west side, and again, you can see the columns all fallen down in a certain direction, which in this case is north. There are also examples in other Decapolis cities. Top left, Scythopolis, actually one of the largest of the Decapolis cities, is the only one that lies west of the Jordan River. There you can see extensive use of basalt, that dark-coloured stone, but they use limestone columns along what looks like a street. But here you've actually got the columns falling in two different directions, but quite clearly. Top right, Pella, which I mentioned, 30 kilometres from Gerasa. Again, you can clearly see those columns largely falling in one direction. And the classic, I believe, Hippos, a little hilltop city just east of Lake Tiberias, absolute classic alignment of columns there. Wouldn't it be nice if it was so easy we could use that? Columns can show a variety of earthquake effects that include dislocation and rotation. And it's interesting that a visitor to Gerasa was actually on site in 1837 when there was an earthquake and noted the columns chattering on their bases. They were jittering up and down. Must have been quite a sight. Now, I said we'd return to Artemis. Now, the casual observer probably doesn't notice this stuff. You've got to be a geologist to actually worry about whether the columns are vertical and all that sort of thing. You're in an ooh-ah moment. But that picture, I think, is quite interesting in that it shows, this is on the west side of the beautiful oval piazza. It's not actually an oval, but it's close to an oval, and largely intact. But you can see there plenty of evidence of dislocation, virtually on every column. But it's still standing, and 57 of the original 64 were still standing when the first Westerner arrived in 1806 with their entablatures. And it's this linking of the columns through their entablatures that I think is critical. And I couldn't find a picture of one, but imagine these architraves. They have little dimples below, cut into the bottom of them, and those dimples fit into recesses on top of the capitals. And that's what keeps them in place. So it looks pretty straightforward, doesn't it, when you look like that and you look at detail and you can see a relative direction of movement, pretty straightforward. Except that when you start looking, you find opposite movements. And this just leads you to the whole problem of trying to accurately determine where an earthquake came from simple observation. What puzzles me is how those columns moved like that, because I actually thought they were joined by metal. I believe perhaps in this case either they weren't joined or perhaps they were joined through pieces of wood, which over time has simply rotted away, allowing that to happen. It's still a remarkable circumstance, bearing in mind, as we have seen elsewhere on the site, lines of columns were just flattened. Now, some columns have rotated on their bases. Part of what that chap George Moore saw, the chattering on the bases, you can see how this is an Ionic capital, which is rotated clockwise relative to its entablature, and in doing so, it's actually twisted the top architrave slightly out of alignment. Well, it's just lovely to look at. But remarkably, the whole thing's standing. So these are the things that one can observe. It's all a bit non-personal, this really. So where's the human element in all of this? I'll come on to that. But it's actually very rare that you actually see direct human elements amongst the ruins. There's one case where they discovered a box of a lady's jewels dropped on the steps of the cathedral, presumably by somebody in fright trying to escape an earthquake. That's the interpretation. And these were subsequently covered by the rubble. Something that happened so instantaneously, she grabbed all her wealth and was running away and got caught. We don't know where the body is. On the other hand, maybe it was somebody who'd stolen it. Thinking back to what previous speaker was talking about. So let's look now at Gerasa's earthquake history in a little bit more detail. There are more than 60 references to earthquakes in publications on Gerasa, some of which relate to the same site. Now, all relate to the west side of the city, especially the major monuments. However, there is one area on the South Decumanus, which is a cross street to the Cardo Maximus, where there is a housing complex that uniquely encapsulates ruins that span a period of some 500 years. So you can actually look at the record over quite a long period of time in an urban context, and that's quite unusual. With one exception, there are no references to earthquakes prior to the 4th century AD. Contrast to Pella, where in fact they have a number in the BC. There's one that was recorded BC 1350, and another one around about BC 950, but there's nothing in the record so far established at Gerasa for these. There is only limited evidence in Gerasa, in the Gerasa corpus, of earthquake damage in the 4th and 5th centuries, and considerably more in the 6th and 7th centuries. But the most significant impacts in the city and to the whole southern Decapolis occurred in the mid-8th century. So we're just quickly going to look through. This is the earthquake evidence of the 6th century. Pretty scattered. The significance of the red and the pink. The red is more firmly established. The pink is circumstantial. And there's certainly more circumstantial evidence than fixed. 7th century, again, you've got evidence a little more certain this time, but again in that southwest quarter, affecting Hippodrome, Zeus Temple, Camp Hill, as it's so called, the site of a much earlier settlement dating back to the Bronze Age. And this site here is that residential complex I mentioned. This is the South Decumanus. There's another one up here called the North Decumanus. And that's this urban complex with a 500-year history. Now, at Pella, there is also archaeological evidence for mid-7th century earthquake damage as well, so that's reasonably confirmed. Now, middle of the 8th century, serious things happened, and we have extensive evidence on the whole western side of the city. The Hippodrome here, built in the 2nd century, it actually went out of use by the end of the 4th century because of structural failure of the southwest corner. But nevertheless, the structure had been inhabited by potters subsequently, and the structures were eventually ruined finally in this earthquake. So extensive evidence of this event right the way through the city. Serious damage to many of the churches, as I showed you in earlier pictures. But more regionally, the same level of damage, which was severe, extended over a much bigger period, a much bigger area. And you can see in that's the shaded area there. That was where destruction would have been massive. And with that massive destruction, we're talking massive loss of life. Because this earthquake occurred on a winter's night in January, when everybody was at home with their families and with their animals. The suddenness of the event is dramatically revealed in the discovery of crushed human and animal remains in a building on the South Decumanus in Gerasa, reminiscent of an even larger and extraordinary discovery made of human and animal remains in Pella, where they found 7 camels, a bunch of mules, and a handful of chickens crushed in a domestic dwelling. It all happened so suddenly. You can just imagine how terrifying that would have been on a dark, cold winter's night. Given the sloping nature of the city's landscape, it's possible that the earthquake also triggered local landslides, which would have added to the misery of the frightened inhabitants. And there's a 2-hectare landslip on the west bank of the Wadi just south of the town that may also relate to this event. The significance of this, the one south of town, being that it also didn't just involve soil, it actually broke away part of the hillside. The complete lack of information from the city's east side reflects the absence of archaeological excavations and the lack of published material from the few excavations that have been carried out, as this area would surely have been impacted at least the same way as the west side. The dramatic damage from the earthquake evidenced in the room in the South Decumanus points to likely impact more broadly within the city's suburbs, even if hard archaeological evidence of this area is sparse. Unlike the other cities of the southern Decapolis, such as Pella and Hippos, which were abandoned after the 749 earthquake, it was that bad, permanently abandoned in the case of Hippos, evidence from this Umayyad house on the South Decumanus and the rebuilding of an Umayyad mosque demonstrates that Gerasa eventually recovered from the devastation that followed the 749 event. After the 8th century, the next attested earthquake affecting Gerasa is that of January 1837, which was witnessed, as I've already mentioned, by a Western visitor, a certain Irishman called George Moore. There would have undoubtedly been other earthquakes in the intervening period, but the settlement had been reduced to the size of perhaps a village by the 12th century and thus any damage would likely have gone unreported. There are no towns of any size in the broader southern Decapolis area at this time. Possible earthquake candidates for this period would be those of 1033 AD, 1202. The 1202 event had an epicentre in the northern Jordan Valley and had major impacts across Syria and the Hauran, which is an area southeast of Syria. But there is little, if any, evidence of it affecting areas further south in Jordan. However, even lesser intensity impacts in Jerash could have damaged the poor quality Arab housing likely present in Jerash at this time in the Ayyubid dynasty. This plan shows the distribution, the estimated distribution of damage, and it's actually a poor quality image, the best I could find. That's Jerash there, it's on line 6. These numbers here, they're not Richter scale numbers. These are numbers that relate to quantities of damage. So you can link the same type of damage in a contour. It's not the same as a plan showing epicenters and the amount of energy released at the source. But this is at category 6, not like a category 8 or 10, which we saw before, so it's much less significant. It still would have had an impact on any domestic housing in Jerash, except they'd already been totally ruined by a previous earthquake, so there was not much to work on. And as I mentioned, Moore noted that the columns were chattering on their bases, but he didn't mention any other damage. Contrary to some published accounts, recent research indicates that settlement on the site of the ancient city continued through the later Arab period, but at a much reduced size, perhaps that of a village. In the Mamluk period, 13th century, inhabitants lived amongst the ruins in roughly built structures between the Oval Piazza and the North Theatre, all on the west side. And we know that because it's archaeologically attested. We know from census records, because there was a wonderful census conducted in 1597 by the Ottomans that captured information on this area. So census records tell us that there was a small village-sized community existed on site somewhere in the 16th century. Location uncertain. And permanent settlement finished sometime after that census and before the start of the 19th century. The ruins lie on opposing slopes of a valley that have been partially protected from further ruination by extensive coverage of waterborne debris flows that flowed down the slopes of the two hills on the west side and effectively drowned the site. So these are the hills I'm talking about. This is the west wall. That's the southwest quarter. This is the much bigger hill in the northwest quarter. That's the Artemisian. You can see the red arrows indicate the direction of the slope where these flows would have taken. I'm just going to show you some pictures now of the southern part of the Artemisian. That's a general view of an excavation conducted in the 30s by an American team. You're looking south, and this is the western colonnade of the Temenos. If we're talking about this whole area here is called a Temenos, that we're looking there, looking over the rest of the site, which looks nice, gently flowing slopes. A close-up of that picture shows, in fact, what we're talking about is 5 metres. I'm not sure how tall those guys are, but I'm sure, unless they're very short, we're talking about a thickness of 5 metres, and you can tell just by looking at this material, it's not just wind-blown dust, it's actually some serious stuff, and there's every evidence of it actually being flowing down the contours to bury the ruins. You don't see this, you actually can see a little bit of that still around Artemis, but very few other places. And these deposits obscure the original natural landscape of the city, which was distinctly more terrace and scarp than appears on both sides of the wadi than appears today. So, conclusions. On present information, the ruined monuments that were evident to the first Western visitors are likely to reflect the earthquake damage from the 749 AD event, the last major event that is attested in the area, and to a lesser extent the impact of subsequent seismic and other natural events. The 749 earthquake event is also the best attested in the Gerasa archaeological record, although it should be noted that the record is biased in that it only generally covers the larger monuments and only really tells us about the west side of the city. While the city was undoubtedly affected by many earlier earthquakes in the Roman Byzantine period, hard archaeological evidence is generally lacking. Most published references to these earlier events are at best circumstantial and at worst speculative. There's a tendency for researchers to attribute structural damage and structural change to earthquake damage to the exclusion of other causes. Credible evidence of earlier earthquake events is limited to localised damage on the local terrace of the Zeus temple in the mid-6th century and more general damage in the southwestern part of the city, all of which, into the 7th century, all of which is supported by similar evidence from Pella. Now, I mentioned earlier that the relative lateral movement on the Dead Sea transform in the area we're talking about averages about 5 millimetres a year. Now, if that relative movement was in fact a constant 5 millimetres a year, then the stresses would likely be released gradually in a series of small seismic events and tremors with little or no destructive effect. However, the movement is not constant, which results in stress build-up and the capacity for larger, more destructive quakes, or surface rupturing events, as seismologists call them, such as the devastating 749 AD event that I've described that affected Gerasa and the surrounding cities. The recurrence interval of such events has been estimated to be about 790 years, with an average of 3.3 metres of movement per event. Now, that's a lot of movement, 10 feet. There has been a lack of surface rupturing events for the last 1,000 years that has led to a slip deficit of up to 5 metres, which in turn leads to a view held by some that a major event is long overdue. Certainly it's stimulated quite a bit of government-level interest in what should we do when one of these things happens. Whether true or not, nature occasionally sends up a wake-up call, and I think that this recent image from Jerash is one such timely reminder. Fancy waking up to that in the morning. It's a recent picture. Thank you very much. I couldn't resist it. Any questions? Sorry.
When did that rock fall that car?
Within the last few years. It actually appears in a publication by a Jordanian academic who is describing seismicity in the area. And he's particularly actually looking at landslips, for which there is a long record. It caused mammoth trouble when they were building the highway. They managed to build the highway from Amman in the worst possible location. And they've had lots of trouble. Sorry? Well, I don't think there's any injury. So, yeah. Interesting. Any other questions?
Did Romans say anything about it?
No, not that I've seen. And I wonder to what extent they learned from their experience, because they would have experienced many tremors, and I would like to think that they modified their construction techniques over time to perhaps accommodate them. But I'm not, sorry?
Geologically, it's not very long ago, isn't it?
No, it's not. So I don't know whether there's a whopper coming or not. But the trouble is, unless you actually get some reminders of these things through lesser tremors, people get very casual about it, you know. Yes, sir?
With the flow of material on the hillside on the western slopes, there's every chance then that there's some other archaeological sites or
Oh, yes. There's only 15% of the total area of the city, which is 85 odd hectares, that have been excavated. So there's huge gaps. And part of the reason there's huge gaps is, well, that's a big area anyway, but right from the 1920s, the government took a view. They saw this as an opportunity to get people, visitors to come, tourism industry. And that led them to focus on clearing out of the South Theatre, which is a beautiful structure, a long-standing process of restoration, unfortunately. It's not just planting, putting columns back up more or less in their original position, but also some of the major monuments have been structurally adjusted. There's different views on that. I mean, some of it had to be done because some of them were literally going to fall down unless they did some maintenance, but they've gone beyond that. But I'm not going to go into that now. But yes, there are lots. And in fact, especially on the west side and on the hillsides above these big monuments, where I believe, I don't have a slide to show you, but where I believe there were urban, suburbs. And there's a joint Danish-German team now working on the west side of the city, specifically looking at these suburban areas. They specifically chose a place where there were no known big monuments. They wanted to get at understanding about the lives of the people, not just where they worshipped and all the grand stuff. They actually wanted to get down to the nitty-gritty. Something that we know quite a bit more about at Pella, as I mentioned. We really do need a lot of that, more of that in Gerasa. Some of those blocks, yes, it does look like Lego, you're quite right. Sorry.
Is there anything in the written record about depopulation of that city or the seismic activity? No. Sorry, about the 749 event? I don't believe so. But there must have been massive loss of life, and there would have been a movement of people, surely. Although, as I mentioned, we know that Gerasa continued as a city for another 200 years, but it was past its peak. Now, it wasn't just because of the Muslim conquest. I mean, there's a view some people have that when the Muslims came, there was death, destruction, and everybody ran away. Well, that wasn't the case here. Certainly there was some damage in Jerusalem. There's no evidence of any damage through the Muslim occupation in Gerasa, and indeed the little village called Rehab just to the east there, they were still building new churches after the Muslim takeover. So, but no, in direct answer to your question, I'm not aware of any. But subsequently there was a depopulation, and to an extent, 10th, 11th century, we believe it was partly due to the fact that Gerasa was no longer on a preferred caravan route, so the trade wasn't there. The political focus moved from there to another town, so basically it just lost influence, and with it the people, the trade and the money. Add to that a few other climatic things perhaps. Maybe it's a series of events. It's a matter that's a number of people are looking at, but we haven't got any firm answers yet. Yes?
Was there damage in the wider region from the 6th, 7th centuries onwards, or was there something special about the seismic location of Gerasa that made it
The answer is we don't know, because there has been so little excavation, very little archaeological excavation outside of the city. So it may well have, there must be a record out there, but we know very little of it. I mean, there are some quite substantive sites quite close to the city, just outside, that have not seen a trowel laid on them. Also, the Department of Antiquities does its own excavation, but doesn't publish the results. So we don't really, there's a combination there of, from my own knowledge, there's very little excavation been done. There's a bit more that's in the published corpus, because, as I say, the government's involved in it, but we really don't know. But that must have affected a much wider region, yeah. And more specifically because in those rural areas, the structures would have been, not massive, just the rural type, made by peasants. They fall down easily. Okay, well, thanks very much.